As I live and breathe, just this, watching Ezra Klein, listening to Ezra Klein with this Zach Buchkip guy. I've never heard of him before, but he is well versed on Israeli society, every inch of it. And that's the guest for Ezra's latest podcast, and I'm only 5 minutes in, but what he's describing shows to me, and I wonder if he'll remark on it as the podcast ensues, but I doubt it. What it shows to me, what he's describing is a fundamental asymmetry in the mainstream press in the West, in how the wishes of Israelis are treated, right now Israelis, and how the wishes, which are every bit as ambitious, the wishes of Ukrainians have been treated from about February 2022. You know, there's these large consensus, kind of near totalist consensus in Israel right now in terms of what needs to be done, and that is, we just need to take out Hamas. He's talking about a peacenik involved in Israeli society, a politician, and other activists affiliated with her, and she's just, as a peacenik, she's saying there's no other option. We can't have this happen again. This is a consensus in Israeli society, from the warhawks to the peaceniks. Zach Buchkip, I've never heard of him before, but he's very insightful, and I'm only 5 minutes into the podcast, but will he make this observation? That these are earnest wishes of the massive majority of something like 99% of the Israeli population. We can't have this happen. IDF has to take these guys out, come hell or high water. And those wishes, there's an asymmetry in treatment. Those wishes are not pedestalized the way the wishes of the Ukrainians, which I would say, one could point out, one could argue convincingly, are every bit as ambitious in terms of the risks involved. If we just isolate the preferences of the Ukrainian population and of the Israeli population, these are very, they're not wrong-headed, but they're very ambitious in terms of what the international scene is. Just the way it is right now, there's not much to international order. This is mostly facade. This is mostly a kind of legalist dance. And so from that perspective, that realist perspective, these are very ambitious wishes on the part of these two populations. If we just isolate all other concerns and fixate on those two, we can say that what they have in common is they're both very ambitious, and nonetheless in the mainstream press there is an asymmetry. One side's concerns get treated much better and pedestalized, and there's kind of almost one-sided stories told about them that is in favor of the Ukrainians, against the Russians, and I would say for good reasons, but it's not extended to the peaceniks in Israel who right now are saying, we can't have this happen again, we've got to take these guys out. Why does that asymmetry exist? Can someone explain to me, can someone get to the bottom of a ethical principle that justifies one such asymmetry in treatment on the part of the mainstream press and even online fringe press? You guys are nowhere near as sympathetic to the Israelis as you are to the Ukrainians. The respectable among you. I'm not making any claim that I know what the right thing to do is. I'm just pointing out, it's amazing. It's amazing that there's nothing in the way of an ethical principle for this distinction. There's only, the Israelis are kind of white and the Gazans sure as hell aren't. Whereas in the case of Ukraine versus Russia, it's just white guys taking out white guys, white populations taking out white populations. I think this is just a kind of decolonial stamp of bullshit. This is not people's best thinking. The fact that there's such a asymmetry in the mainstream press of how these two groups are treated and how much sympathy there is for them, this is kind of decolonial creep. And I wonder if they're going to get into any of this in this podcast, but I'm going to resume it right now. I'm going to link it. It's a great podcast. Ezra Klein, Zach Buch, something. Fascinating stuff. Do you agree with me? Do you think there is an ethical principle that says we ought to treat the concerns of Ukrainians far more seriously and essentially pedestalize them and take all kinds of geostrategic risks with them? Do you believe that that's more justified than doing so for wishes of the Israelis in isolation? I don't think there's an ethical principle at the bottom of that. I think this is just when you see the carryovers from decolonial crap that treats, you know, non-white on white crimes. It puts a magnifying glass on white on non-white crimes to the exclusion of just about everything else. That's decolonial theory for you. I'm so glad I read out the Atlantic article against it, but this is just my own kind of rant. Now I see it in everything. I'm listening to this podcast and I'm like, right there, the difference between the Israeli and the Ukrainian levels of sympathy. This is decolonialization creep. God, I'm so glad I read out the Atlantic essay. Captures it much more calmly than I'm capturing it now.
Stand up to an administration which is too male, too pale, and too stale. Too male, too pale, and too stale. Too male, too pale, and too stale. And we will not go away silently. We will not be silent.
Now, here's a bit of a wild one. If they were to write about this channel, No Avail, if they, I mean, the Hollywood hacks, current crop of Hollywood hacks, I'm sure they're every bit as hacky as previous installations of Hollywood hacks. If they had to write about this channel with me as the protagonist of my own weird show, and they had to kind of pin me down accurately enough, it was going to be kind of a homage to the No Avail channel, that these current hacky crop of Hollywood type screenwriters and stuff like that had to write about it, but had to pin it down accurately enough. And so they would certainly go, it's like, okay, God damn it, so we can't have him as the bigot. There's going to be some bigots in the show, and it's like some characters will be plain bigots and some will plainly not be. And in this type of show, they would go like, oh God, we so wanted to, but we can't have him be one of the bigots. Shows about his YouTube channel, and there's some bigots in the show, but God damn it, we really could have thrown a pie in his face by making him into one of the bigots, but we have to stay accurate to reality enough, so God damn it, we can't have him be one of the bigots. But I'll tell you what we can do. Let's have him be this guy who just, with time, starts referencing things like Clown World more and more, starts incorporating more of these Pepe style memes. Let's have him be one of the guys who gets just increasingly with time, gets more racially aloof, like the white guy who gets a little too racially aloof and blunt, and it happens in these gradual stages, but not bigoted. Just let's call it racially aloof, and one of these guys who just exhibits zero reverence for, you know, ladies and gentlemen, the normative status of ladies and gentlemen, whether in society, to the extent that the society is good, the men are gentlemen and the women are ladies. It's like this guy has just such irreverence for this crap and for the propagation of the species. That's kind of what his channel is about. He doesn't want to see the species propagated because he understands the collateral damage is unnecessary and no one volunteers for it. Hence, he references stories like the ones who walk away from Omelas, where we say no to collateral damage in spirit. That's kind of what Omelas is about. But if they had to write about this channel, they would make me into the type of guy who, they can't make me a bigot, but they would make me racially aloof over time, as can be exhibited by reality, and they would make me increasingly hostile to big chivalry and to the normative status of ladies and gentlemen, being positive. No, I'm saying that's negative. I'm saying we ought to be individuals. But that's how they would kind of have to sum me up. I'd watch that show. I hope you'd watch that show. I might devise one such show among all these other fictions that I'm devising. Natalist Gulag, South Park ending. A lot of these things I will have to keep devising.
Do you think Piers Morgan, on fair grounds, would try and speak to me about an issue like this? Or Ben Shapiro, when they know what I'm going to come with? Absolutely not. Don't pretend you don't know who I am. You've been watching my videos. You know what I'm about. Your silence is deafening. And your cowardice is apparent.
You have a lot to say about this issue, obviously. So I thank you for coming in, but I'm not too cowardly to talk to you. to have had all voices on the show.
I commend you for that, actually, to be honest, for bringing me on. But do realise I did caveat that with on fair ground. So let's hope that this interview is conducted.
I intend to be completely fair.
Yeah, sure.
I promise you, because all I want to get to here is a real sense of what is going to happen. We can all look back at. We can all look back. Let me just. We can all look back.
Before that, Piers.
Yeah.
Sorry, if you want to say fair grounds, you introduced me as a Palestinian controversial.
I actually corrected myself.
Right. So
I said pro-Palestinian. I meant to say
So
pro-Palestinian.
why did the word controversial come into play?
I think you're controversial.
So are you.
Yeah, I wouldn't deny
So is
that.
the ambassador. Why didn't you introduce her in that manner?
I'm happy to say that to many people, her views would be controversial.
So why didn't you introduce me as the Oxford graduate?
Do you want to be introduced as that?
Yes.
Okay, or an Oxford graduate.
Go ahead.
Okay.
There's a kind of symbolic, I'm going to say a symbolic appropriateness that gets at what I refer to as the epistemic tease qua ideation. When you really go deep on this, you'll see how there's a kind of symbolic appropriateness to the fact that people just don't get how the very best music they're going to hear in their lives is the kind of music that it's not meant to hook them on the first listen. It might be pleasant on the first listen, but it's not going to be the kind of music that's going to end up in their top, 20, 50 all-time favorite songs or records or stuff like that. It's precisely designed to not be enjoyed at its peak on the first listen. It might even be dull and drabby, and it might even drag and disappoint on the first listen. But still, the acute music listener will hear something to it and will return to it. Or it'll just be one of their favorite bands, and so they may be underwhelmed for like a full week by the song, and then it just escalates from there. Vast majority of people I discuss music with, they just don't get that. And that's why I'm so disappointed by the feedback I get when I tell people to listen to X, Y, and Z song. They just don't get that the best music is the music that precisely is not the type that hooks them on the first listen. And there's a kind of symbolic appropriateness to that because there's all these other more important issues that people don't get precisely because of that kind of a lack of patience. You need to be a conceptually patient person to have a clear picture into reality. And people just don't have that kind of conceptual patience. And as they don't have a musical patience to them, to understand, you don't give me feedback to a song 10 or 15 seconds in, or even a minute in. If you're listening, if I'm linking you to an 8-minute song, you don't give me feedback on it a minute in. This is kind of Floyd appreciation 101, Pink Floyd. God, we're in such a stupid era. Well, I can't just say Floyd. People might think of George Floyd, so I have to say Pink Floyd. We're in a stupid era, and I'm grumpy, but I just want to add this. Their lack of musical patience and musical understanding. Best kind of music is the kind of music that grows on you gradually and maybe even too slowly. And that lack of musical patience, there's a symbolic appropriateness because it reflects also their lack of conceptual patience. It's why they're all low resolution. And think there's nothing outside the terms they cleave to, the isms they cleave to, which I won't freaking dignify by referencing directly. But they're on the spectrum, in the other kind of spectrum way, and they just can't see how there's a whole world outside of their spectrum. They're conceptually impatient, just as they're musically impatient, because they're fearful and beastly. They're too beastly. You know, it's so bad because I do have so much old stuff I have to get to. But after what October has been thus far, it's October 28th. After what October has been, I was like thinking to myself, God, the next video is going to be a nice break from anything invoking Schop. I'm so proud of myself. And the video after that is going to be evading Schop as well. It's like, no, I can't. Because I just listened to On the Essential Imperfections of the Intellect. And I'm listening to this and I'm thinking what kind of October we've had. And I'm like, I have a lot of things planned that don't involve Schop. Other things that do. But it's like I've been kind of secretly embarrassed about how often I invoke him. But God fucking damn it, after this October we've had, it's like I have all these plans for videos, but they have to just be put on hold because I have to read for my video, just for my sanity. I have to read in the wake of everything that's been reinforced about group identity since I've uploaded that video. It's never been this clear with a single upload in the past, where I upload something and then everything that reverberates in the greater culture just reinforces what I say in the goddamn video. So much more so after the upload date. This happened with my last video. That's what kind of a crazy October we've had. And it's like, I was gonna plan to upload a video on YouTube that's all about me ranting about YouTube. And I'm like, that was supposed to be the next thing, but that can't be the next thing, because we've just had such an amazingly stupid October that I have to read Schop's chapter on the essential imperfections of the intellect and what he does toward the end of it. I just gave it a good spin in terms of audio. There's nothing else that fits tail end of October on a channel called No Avail. There's nothing that fits the end of October 2023 other than me reading on the essential imperfections of the intellect. It's like chapter 15. There's other things that need to be read. But now I'm just walking back home from work. Finally back at work. I took some time off. Not gonna get into that, why I had to take time off even though I've got a vacation coming up tail end of November. It's like, why did I? Well, that's how out of it I was. But I'm finally back in the groove of recording. I was so passionless about everything YouTube related, even though my next video was supposed to be ranting on YouTube about nothing but YouTube. That was gonna be like, started out some recordings from early September and then mid-September and then like July. I was gonna combine them all. Like, that's gonna have to go on hold. I have to read on the essential imperfections of the intellect as I've been observing them throughout October, reinforcing everything I said about group identity. So I gotta read it out, and just the way Schop goes on attack mode in terms of the masses toward the end. On the essential imperfections, it is woven together masterfully. I can't wait to get home and to read this stuff. But that's just how crazy of an October we have had. Sorry for the repetition, I'm just on the liftoff. I listened to this chapter and kablamo, just eureka, kablamo, eureka. That's what my next video is gonna have to be, this fucking goddamn glorious chapter. And I'll get to it right now. I'm still not back, text is not in front of me, I'm still out, but I just wanna set up what's gonna happen. So, you need your celery first, and the Schop chapter is celery. The meat and potatoes is the Atlantic article. There's a fabulous Atlantic article, but for it to land, you first need your celery. The celery is very sugary at the end. You can make the case it gets gradually sugary as you dig into it, but it is celery compared to the meat and potatoes and perhaps the dessert of the Atlantic article that is about decolonization. In critique of decolonization. For that to land right, I gotta read out this chapter on the essential imperfections of the intellect. I'm gonna start as soon as I get home, but I am out right now, but it needs this setup. Okay, and to close this line of commentary, I just have to note one thing. Halloween will have come and passed by the time I get around to reading all these things, Atlantic and the Schop chapter, so there's no way I'm getting this up before Halloween. It will have come and passed by now, but I just want to pose one thing that I've been thinking about. This is kind of my comedic barometer and where I draw the threshold, I guess, of permissibility. Like the person who doesn't hold any kind of sympathy with Hamas, who agrees with everything I've read out here about the inanity and falseness of decolonization, that kind of person, you know, that it's not just that they don't sympathize with Hamas or even the Palestinian cause in general, but they don't go in on this silly decolonization stuff. And so that person shows up in a quote-unquote Halloween costume as a Hamas operator of some sort, a Hamas co-conspirator. That's his shtick. He wants to be edgy comedically, and so he shows up to Halloween as one of the Hamas members, sporting whatever kind of goods that you might imagine now. Let's just those be the goods for to tailor to your idiosyncrasy. What's as a costume, what's the biggest tell? If someone just wanted to be offensive by showing up to a Halloween party in a Hamas outfit. So imagine, according to your liking, that Hamas outfit. Now, this is if you meet the bar, as far as I'm concerned. To the extent that we know that this is not a potentially violent person, given their actual views, this is just a person who's really obsessed with being comically edgy. You just have to understand, I believe there's absolutely nothing offensive about that. If you want to be the person who shows up in a Hamas outfit for Halloween, just as far as I'm concerned, that we must never create the kind of comedic Overton window where that's impermissible and we lambast that person for the rest of their lives, as with other things like blackface. Because we're in a very weird space right now, just in terms of comedic attitudes. Things are constraining. I made a few points about it being constrained in terms of just censorship, like the banning of the Palestinian rallies. But I'm seeing it also in terms of people's attitudes toward comedy. You know, they're quick to accuse. And I would imagine a lot of people are thinking of certain jokes that they're not saying because they don't want to be accused of being anti-something. And so it's just, well, yeah, I made the points about censorship, but I think I'm also saying more comedic self-censorship. And I don't know, I've not done anything for Halloween since I was like 14, but I think this may be the one year where I'm actually motivated to do something for Halloween. And given that I'd like to think people know what my views are, that I've got nothing in the way of sympathy for Hamas or any of these other terrorist outfits or radical militant outfits or the decolonization story itself, I might be tempted to, in a handful of days here, show up, because I'm actually working on the night of Halloween, and it's like, if I show up in some sort of a Hamas getup, what will happen? There's no way anyone's going to actually think that I'm a potentially dangerous person, but it will be perceived as very, very distasteful, and I will be perceived as being anti-something, just as I've seen many other people who, you know, they're making the kind of points that they're not even going as far as I would go, whether it's in terms of just being offensive comedically or just spouting something. And I see them get accused of being anti-something. And I'm like, wow, if I were that person, I would also be accused of being anti-something. But it's like, I know myself. I look in my heart of hearts and I know that I'm not, and I've never been anti-something, but we're in a weird climate where it's like it just doesn't take much at all to be perceived, and that's the kicker, right? Because it's not always the case that they'll IRL, like online, obviously they'll tell you if they perceive you as being anti-something, they'll let you know. But offline, it's like I have to, just because I know I won't get accused and it will only be thought and assumed that I'm anti-something, and that I won't even have a chance to defend myself because the accusation will not be spoken. And so I'm almost myself veering off into this self-censorship stuff in numerous ways, because people are so quick to assume that others who disagree with them on a whole host of issues that have nothing to do with like what your view is of entire groups of people in terms of their essence. Like if you just have some nearby opinion, that's enough to get you called anti-something. But I picture a world where even, as far as we know their views, even that person who shows up to a Halloween party in one such offensive outfit would not be assumed to be anti-something. And so it's just bizarre. I've been hush-hush. I've been so out of it. I'm not going to say what I've been out of it with, but I've been pretty out of it for much of October. And so I'm just observing from a distance, and I'm like, God, if I were smack in the middle of these conversations, I too would be one of these people who would be accused of being anti-something. And I've never thought of myself as being even potentially in the realm of being someone who could be a target for being perceived as being anti-something. But I think every single viewer who's been watching me, whether you've been watching me for a long time or a short time, you know I'm not anti-something, even though I've got these permissive views on Halloween costumes and things of that sort. And all the hacks who've been using the term like cancel culture, what October has shown, better than any previous month, what I couldn't have predicted, what October has shown is that everyone's pretty much on board with cancel culture. The only difference is their baselines and the bright lines they're willing to draw in the sand. They don't view that as cancel culture. Cancel culture is when your ideological foes are too outraged to be able to just sit back and relax and enjoy some kind of offensive comedy, right? If they're too uppity about it, then it's cancel culture. If you're uppity about your own sorts of things, well, that's not cancel culture. That's just you being a good moral foot soldier and constraining things in ways you view appropriate. And it's just a whole bunch of duplicity, and October's unveiled it in ways that I could not have fathomed, even after the 7th. Like, I knew things were going to get a little, we were going to get a little somber, and all these public figures who come out with these statements and things of that sort, but I could not have foreseen the level of humorlessness that it would instill in so many public commentators. And so if this ever goes viral, it won't, but if it does, you can bet your bottom dollar I would be called just for having this lax view on the Hamas outfit at a hypothetical Halloween, which I might actually do. But you can bet your bottom dollar there would be an endless stream of people who would say that therefore I am anti-something. But I'm not. Welcome to Spooky Reads. I'm your host, No Avail. I'll be a reader too. I'm finally back home. And yes, I guess I have enough ambition. I've got over ambition now in terms of to do a number of things all on one day, because I was so out of it for the longest time. I'm back. I'm ready to read this stuff out. I guess I am just keeping it as a Halloween-themed video. I've got that kind of weird penchant because it's a calendar thing, and I hate calendar things. But let's read this stuff out. It is a spooky chapter. I don't think it's just the nature of the fact that it's Halloween season. I think this would have landed as a spooky thing if you've got the right kind of values. Forget being spooked out by the horror genre, which is never scary. I don't get people who are scared by that stuff, whether films or books and stuff like that. But this, to me, should be part of the horror genre, even though it's brilliant, because what it describes is a kind of limitation. We are just so defenseless and just so, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to use the word again, ignoble in our limitation in terms of what we can perceive compared to the, as Schop would explain, compared to the, omnipercipient agent, what the theist would call God, but what I'll just call the omnipercipient agent, a being that's not as limited intellectually as we are, because its intellect didn't evolve for the purposes that ours did. So it's spooky in an evergreen way, let's just say. At least if you're like me, if you've got the right kind of values, if you care about the right kind of things, this chapter will spook you the fuck out. If you're, a cognitive enthusiast, as opposed to an enthusiast for anything else. So, spooky time. That's chapter 15 from The World is Will and Representation, written by Arthur Schopenhauer, on the essential imperfections of the intellect. Our self-consciousness has not space but only time as its form, and therefore we do not think in 3 dimensions as we perceive, but only in one, thus in a line, without breadth or depth. This is the source of the greatest of the essential imperfections of our intellect. We can know all things only in succession, and can become conscious of only one at a time. Indeed, even of this one, only under the condition that for the time we forget everything else, thus are absolutely unconscious of everything else, so that for the time it ceases to exist as far as we are concerned. In respect of this quality, our intellect may be compared to a telescope with a very narrow field of vision. Just because our consciousness is not stationary but fleeting, the intellect apprehends only successively, and in order to grasp one thing must let another go, retaining nothing but traces of it which are ever becoming weaker. The thought which is vividly present to me now must after a little while have escaped me altogether, and if a good night's sleep intervene, it may be that I shall never find it again, unless it is connected with my personal interests, that is, with my will, which always commands the field. Upon this imperfection of the intellect depends the disconnected and often fragmentary nature of our course of thought. which I have already touched on at the close of the last chapter, and from this again arises the unavoidable distraction of our thinking. Sometimes external impressions of sense throng in upon it, disturbing and interrupting it, forcing different kinds of things upon it every moment. Sometimes one thought draws in another by the bond of association, and is now itself dislodged by it. Sometimes, lastly, the intellect itself is not capable of fixing itself very long and continuously at a time upon one thought, but as the eye, when it gazes long at one object, is soon unable to see it any more distinctly, because the outlines run into each other and become confused, until finally all is obscure. So through long continued reflection upon one subject, our thinking also is gradually confused, becomes dull, and ends in complete stupor. Therefore, after a certain time, which varies with the individual, we must for the present give up every meditation or deliberation which has had the fortune to remain undisturbed, but yet has not been brought to an end, even if it concerns a matter which is most important and pertinent to us. And we must dismiss from our consciousness the subject which interests us so much, however heavily our anxiety about it may weigh upon us, in order to occupy ourselves now with insignificant and indifferent things. During this time, that important subject no longer exists for us. It is like the heat in cold water, latent. If now we assume it again at another time, we approach it like a new thing with which we become acquainted anew, although more quickly, but the agreeable or disagreeable impression of it is also produced anew upon our will. We ourselves, however, do not come back quite unchanged, for with the physical composition of the humorous intention of the nerves, which constantly changes with the hours, days, and years, our mood and point of view also changes. Moreover, the different kinds of ideas which have been there in the meantime have left an echo behind them, the tone of which influences the ideas which follow. Therefore, the same thing appears to us at different times, in the morning, in the evening, at midday, or on another day, often very different. Opposite views of it now press upon each other and increase our doubt. Hence we speak of sleeping upon a matter, and for important determinations we demand a long time for consideration. Now, although this quality of our intellect, as springing from its weakness, has its evident disadvantages, yet on the other hand it affords the advantage that after the distraction and the physical change, we return to our subject as comparatively new beings, fresh and strange, and thus are able to see it repeatedly in very different lights. From all this, it is plain that human consciousness and thought is in its nature necessarily fragmentary, on account of which the theoretical and practical results which are achieved by piecing together such fragments are for the most part defective. In this, our thinking consciousness is like a magic lantern, in the focus of which only one picture can appear at a time, and each, even if it represents the noblest objects, must yet soon pass away in order to make room for others of a different and even most vulgar description. In practical matters, the most important plans and resolutions are formed in general, but others are subordinated to these as means to an end, and others again are subordinated to these, and so on down to the particular case that has to be carried out in concreto. They do not, however, come to be carried out in order of their dignity, but while we are occupied with plans which are great and general, we have to contend with the most trifling details and the cares of the moment. In this way, our consciousness becomes still more desultory. In general, theoretical occupations of the mind unfit us for practical affairs and vice versa. In consequence of the inevitably distracted and fragmentary nature of all our thinking, which has been pointed out, and the mingling of ideas of different kinds thereby introduced, to which even the noblest human minds are subject, we really have only half a consciousness with which to grope about in the labyrinth of our life and the obscurity of our investigations. Bright moments sometimes illuminate our path like lightning. But what is to be expected of heads of which even the wisest is every night the scene of the strangest and most senseless dreams, and which has to take up its meditations again on awaking from these? Clearly, a consciousness which is subject to such great limitations is little suited for solving the riddle of the world, and such an endeavor would necessarily appear strange and pitiful to a being of a higher order whose intellect had not time as its form, and whose thinking had thus true completeness and unity. Indeed, it is really wonderful that we are not completely confused by the very heterogeneous mixture of ideas and fragments of thought of every kind which are constantly crossing each other in our minds, but are yet always able to see our way again and make everything agree together. Clearly, there must exist a simpler thread upon which everything branches itself together, but what is this? Memory alone is not sufficient, for it has essential limitations of which I shall speak shortly, and besides this, it is exceedingly imperfect and untrustworthy. The logical ego, or even the transcendental synthetic unity of apperception, are expressions and explanations which will not easily serve to make the matter comprehensible. They will rather suggest to many, quote, "'Tis true your beard is curly, yet it will not draw you the bolt," end quote. I guess it's just a quote. He doesn't reference who it's from. Kant's proposition, quote, "The I think must accompany all our ideas," end quote, is insufficient, for the, quote, "I" is an unknown quantity, i.e., it is itself a secret. That which gives unity and connection to consciousness in that it runs through all its ideas and is thus its substratum, its permanent supporter, cannot itself be conditioned by consciousness, therefore cannot be an idea. Rather, it must be the preuse of consciousness and the root of the tree of which that is the fruit. This, I say, is the will. It alone is unchangeable and absolutely identical, and has brought forth consciousness for its own ends. Therefore, it is also the will which gives it unity and holds together all its ideas and thoughts, accompanying them like a continuous harmony. Without it, the intellect would no longer have the unity of consciousness as a mirror in which now this and now that successively presents itself, or at the most only so much as a convex mirror whose rays unite in an imaginary point behind its surface. But the will alone is that which is permanent and unchangeable in consciousness. It is the will which holds together all thoughts and ideas as means to its ends, and tinges them with the color of its own character, its mood, its interests, commands the attention, and holds in its hand the train of motives whose influence ultimately sets memory and the association of ideas in activity. At bottom, it is the will that is spoken of whenever, quote, "I" appears in a judgment. Thus, it is the true and final point of unity of consciousness and the bond of its functions and acts. It does not itself, however, belong to the intellect, but is only its root, source, and controller. From the form of time and the single dimension of the series of ideas, on account of which, in order to make up one, the intellect must let all others fall, there follows not only its distraction, but also its forgetfulness. Most of what it lets fall, it never takes up again, especially since the taking up again is bound to the principle of sufficient reason, and thus demands an occasion which the association of thoughts and motivation have first to supply, an occasion, however, which may be the more remote and smaller in proportion as our sensibility for it is heightened by our interest in the subject. But memory, as I have already shown in the essay on the principle of sufficient reason, is not a storehouse, but merely a faculty acquired by practice of calling up ideas at pleasure, which must therefore constantly be kept in practice by use, for otherwise it will gradually be lost. Accordingly, the knowledge even of the learned man exists only virtualiter, as an acquired facility in calling up certain ideas. Actualiter, on the other hand, it is also confined to one idea, and is only conscious of this one at a time. Hence arises a strange contrast between what he knows potentia and what he knows actu. That is, between his knowledge and what he thinks at any moment. The former is an immense and always somewhat chaotic mass. The latter is a single distinct thought. The relation resembles that between the innumerable stars of the heavens and the limited field of vision of the telescope. It appears in a striking manner when upon some occasion he wishes to call distinctly to his remembrance some particular circumstance in his knowledge, and time and trouble are required to produce it from that chaos. Rapidity in doing this is a special gift, but is very dependent upon day and hour. Therefore, memory sometimes refuses us its service, even in things which at another time it has readily at hand. This consideration calls us in our studies to strive more to attain to correct insight than to increase our learning, and to lay it to heart that the quality of knowledge is more important than its quantity. The latter imparts to books only thickness, the former thoroughness and also style, for it is an intensive quantity, while the other is merely extensive. It consists in the distinctness and completeness of the conceptions, together with the purity and accuracy of the knowledge of perception, which forms their foundation. Therefore, the whole of knowledge in all its parts is penetrated by it, and in proportion as it is so, is valuable or trifling. With a small quantity, but of good quality, one achieves more than with a very large quantity of bad quality. The most perfect and satisfactory knowledge is that of perception, but it is limited absolutely to the particular, the individual. The combination of the many and the different in one idea is only possible through the conception, that is, through the omission of the differences. Therefore, this is a very imperfect manner of presenting things to the mind. Certainly, the particular also can be distinctly comprehended as a universal if it is raised to the Platonic idea. But in this process, which I have analyzed in the third book, the intellect already passes beyond the limits of individuality, and therefore of time. Moreover, it is only an exception. These inner and essential imperfections of the intellect are further increased by a disturbance which, to a certain extent, is external to it, but is yet unceasing, the influence exerted by the will upon all its operations whenever it is in any way concerned in their result. Every passion, indeed every inclination and aversion, tinges the objects of knowledge with its color. Of most common occurrence is the falsifying of knowledge, which is brought about by wishes and hopes, for they picture to us the scarcely possible as probable and as well nigh certain, and make us almost incapable of comprehending what is opposed to it. Fear acts in a similar way, and every preconceived opinion, every partiality, and, as has been said, every interest, every emotion and inclination of the will, acts in an analogous manner. To all these imperfections of the intellect, we have finally to add this, that it grows old with the brain, that is, like all physiological functions, it loses its energy in later years, whereby all its imperfections are then much increased. The defective nature of the intellect here set forth will not, however, surprise us if we look back at its origin and destiny as established by me in the second book. Nature has produced it for the service of an individual will. Therefore, it is only designed to know things so far as they afford the motives of such a will, but not to fathom them or comprehend them in their true being. Human intellect is only a higher gradation of the intellect of the brutes, and as this is entirely confined to the present, our intellect also bears strong traces of this limitation. Therefore, our memory and recollection is something very imperfect. How little of all that we have done, experienced, learned, or read can we recall? And even this little, for the most part, only laboriously and imperfectly. For the same reasons, it is so very difficult for us to keep ourselves free from the impressions of the present. Unconsciousness is the original and natural condition of all things, and therefore also the basis from which, in particular species of beings, consciousness results as their highest efflorescence. Wherefore, even then, unconsciousness always continues to predominate. Accordingly, most existences are without consciousness, but they act according to the laws of their nature, i.e., of their will. Plants have at most a very weak analog of consciousness. The lowest species of animals only the dawn of it. But even after it has ascended through the whole series of animals to man and his reason, the unconsciousness of plants, from which it started, still remains the foundation and may be traced in the necessity for sleep, and also in all those essential and great imperfections here set forth of every intellect produced through physiological functions, and of another intellect we have no conception. The imperfections here proved to be essential to the intellect are constantly increased, however, in particular cases by non-essential imperfections. The intellect is never in every respect what it possibly might be. The perfections possible to it are so opposed that they exclude each other. Therefore, no man can be at once Plato and Aristotle, or Shakespeare and Newton, or Kant and Goethe. The imperfections of the intellect, on the contrary, consort very well together. Therefore, in reality, it for the most part remains far below what it might be. Its functions depend upon so very many conditions, which we can only comprehend as anatomical and physiological in the phenomenon in which alone they are given us. that a decidedly excelling intellect, even in one respect alone, is among the rarest of natural phenomena. Therefore, the productions of such an intellect are preserved through thousands of years. Indeed, every relic of such a highly favored individual becomes a most valuable treasure. From such an intellect down to that which approaches imbecility, the gradations are innumerable. And primarily in conformity with these gradations, the mental horizon of each of us varies very much from the mere comprehension of the present, which even the brute has, to that which also embraces the next hour, the day, even the morrow, the week, the year, the life, the century, the 1,000 years, up to that of the consciousness which is almost always present, even though obscurely dawning, the horizon of the infinite, and whose thoughts therefore assume a character in keeping with this. Further, that difference among intelligences shows itself in the rapidity of their thinking, which is very important and which may be as different and as finely graduated as that of the points in the radius of a revolving disk. The remoteness of the consequence and reasons to which anyone's thought can extend seems to stand in a certain relation to the rapidity of his thinking, for the greatest exertion of thought power in general can only last quite a short time, and yet only while it lasts can a thought be thought out in its complete unity. It therefore amounts to this: how far the intellect can pursue it in so short a time, thus what length of path it can travel in it. On the other hand, in the case of some, rapidity may be made up for by the greater duration of that time of perfectly concentrated thought. Probably the slow and lasting thought makes the mathematical mind, while rapidity of thought makes the genius. The latter is a flight, the former a sure advance upon firm ground, step by step. Yet, even in the sciences, whenever it is no longer a question of mere quantities, but of understanding the nature of phenomena, this last kind of thinking is inadequate. This is shown, for example, by Newton's theory of color, and later by Biot's nonsense about color rings, which yet agrees with the whole atomistic method of treating light among the French, with its molécules de l'amour, and in general with their fixed idea of reducing everything in nature to mere mechanical effects. Lastly, the great individual diversity of intelligence we are speaking about shows itself excellently in the degrees of the clearness of understanding, and accordingly in the distinctness of the whole thinking. To one man that is to understand, which to another is only in some degree to observe. The one is already done and at the goal, while the other is only at the beginning. To the one, that is the solution, which to the other is only the problem. This depends on the quality of thought and knowledge, which was already referred to above. As in rooms, the degree of light varies, so does it in minds. We can detect this quality of the whole thought as soon as we have read only a few pages of an author, for in doing so we have been obliged to understand both with his understanding and in his sense, and therefore before we know all that he has thought, we see already how he thinks, what is the formal nature, the texture of his thinking, which remains the same in everything about which he thinks, and whose expression is the train of thought and the style. In this we feel at once the pace, the flexibleness, the lightness, even indeed the soaring power of his mind, or, on the contrary, its dullness, formality, lameness, and leaden quality. For as language is the expression of the mind of a nation, style is the more immediate expression of the mind of an author than even his physiognomy. Yeah, Sharperly did believe in physiognomy. It was probably his greatest blunder. But it was the time. It was a different time. We throw a book aside when we observe that in it we enter an obscure region than our own, unless we have to learn from it mere facts, not thoughts. Apart from mere facts, only that author will afford us profit whose understanding is keener and clearer than our own, who forwards our thinking instead of hindering it, like the dull mind that will force us to keep pace with the toad-like course of its thought. Thus, that author with whose mind it gives us sensible relief and assistance sometimes to think, by whom we feel ourselves born and where we could not have gone alone. Goethe once said to me that if he read a page of Kant, he felt as if he entered a brightly lighted room. Well, just to depart from the text, that's really weird because I could have sworn there was another chapter where he points out how it was a travesty that Goethe and Kant didn't know of the other's existence. No, I have to backtrack on that. But if anyone knows like which one of those two is true, clearly if this was a personal conversation he had with Goethe, then I guess he must have known of Kant. A brightly lighted room. Inferior minds are so not merely because they are distorted and therefore judge falsely, but primarily through the indistinctness of their whole thinking, which may be compared to seeing through a bad telescope when all the outlines appear indistinct and as if obliterated, and the different objects run into each other. The weak understanding of such minds shrinks from the demand for distinctness of conceptions, and therefore they do not themselves make this claim upon it, but put up with haziness, and to satisfy themselves with this they gladly have recourse to words, especially as they denote indefinite, very abstract, unusual conceptions which are hard to explain, such, for example, as infinite and finite, sensible and supersensible, the idea of being, ideas of the reason, the absolute, the idea of the good, the divine, moral freedom, power of spontaneous generation, the absolute idea, subject to object, etc. Ooh, I should keep this in, it'll be entertaining. The like of these they confidently fling about, imagine they really express thoughts, and expect everyone to be content with them, for the highest summit of wisdom which they can see is to have at command such ready-made words for every possible question. This immense satisfaction in words is thoroughly characteristic of inferior minds. It depends simply upon their incapacity for distinct conceptions, whenever these must rise above the most trivial and simple relations, hence upon the weakness and indolence of their intellect, and indeed upon the secret consciousness of this, which in the case of scholars is bound up with the early learned and hard necessity of passing themselves off as thinking beings, to meet which demand in all cases they keep such a suitable store of ready-made words. It must really be amusing to see a professor of philosophy of this kind in the chair, who bona fide delivers such a juggle of words destitute of thoughts, quite sincerely, under the delusion that they are really thoughts, and in front of him the students who, just as bona fide, i.e. under the same delusion, listen attentively and take notes, while yet in reality neither the one nor the other goes beyond the words, but rather these words themselves, together with the audible scratching of pens, are the only realities in the whole matter. This peculiar satisfaction in words has more than anything else to do with the perpetuation of errors, for relying on the words and phrases received from his predecessors, each one confidently passes over obscurities and problems, and thus these are propagated through centuries from book to book. And the thinking man, especially in youth, is in doubt whether it may be that he is incapable of understanding it, or that there really is nothing here to understand. And similarly, whether for others the problem which they all slink past with such comical seriousness by the same path is no problem at all, or whether it is only that they will not see it. Many truths remain undiscovered simply on this account, that no one has the courage to look the problem in the face and grapple with it. On the contrary, the distinctness of thought and the clearness of conceptions peculiar to eminent minds produces the effect that even known truths, when brought forward by them, gain new light, or at least a new stimulus. If we hear them or read them, it is as if we exchanged a bad telescope for a good one. Let one only read, for example, in Euler's Letters to the Princess, his exposition of the fundamental truths of mechanics and optics. Upon this rests the remark of Diderot in the Neveu de Rameau, that only the perfect masters are capable of teaching really well the elements of a science, just because it is only they who really understand the questions, and for them words never take the place of thoughts. But we ought to know that inferior minds are the rule, good minds the exception, eminent minds very rare, and genius a portent. How otherwise could a human race consisting of about 800 million individuals have left so much after 6,000 years to discover, to invent, to think out, and to say? And now in the updated version, I may say, of 8 billion. The intellect is calculated for the support of the individual alone, and as a rule, it is only barely sufficient even for this. But nature has very wisely been very sparing of conferring a larger measure, for For the man of limited intelligence can survey the few and simple relations which lie within his narrow sphere of action, and can control the levers of them with much greater ease than could the eminently intellectual man who commands an incomparably larger sphere and works with long levers. Thus, the insect sees everything on its stem or leaf with the most minute exactness, and better than we, and yet is not aware of the man who stands within 3 steps of it. This is the reason of the slyness of half-witted persons, and the ground of the paradox. And now here's the French sentence, but because it is French, it is easier to automatically translate through Google. And so the sentence says, there is a mystery in the minds of people who don't have one. So just to set up the sentence again, this is the reason of the slyness of half-witted person and the ground of the paradox. There is a mystery in the minds of people who don't have one. For practical life, genius is about as useful as an astral telescope in a theater. Thus, with regard to the intellect, nature is highly aristocratic. The distinctions which it has established are greater than those which are made in any country by birth, rank, wealth, or caste. But in the aristocracy of intellect, as in other aristocracies, there are many thousands of plebeians for one nobleman, many millions for one prince, and the great multitude of men are mere populace, mob, rabble, la canaille. Now, certainly there is a glaring contrast between the scale of rank of nature and that of convention, and their agreement is only to be hoped for in a golden age. Meanwhile, those who stand very high in the one scale of rank and in the other have this in common, that for the most part they live in exalted isolation, to which Byron refers when he says, quote, to feel me in the solitude of kings without the power that makes them bear a crown. For intellect is a differentiating and therefore a separating principle. Its different grades, far more than those of mere culture, give to each man different conceptions, in consequence of which each man lives to a certain extent in a different world, in which he can directly meet those only who are like himself, and can only attempt to speak to the rest and make himself understood by them from a distance. Great differences in the grade and in the cultivation of the understanding fix a wide gulf between man and man, which can only be crossed by benevolence, for it is, on the contrary, the unifying principle which identifies everyone else with its own self. Yet the connection remains a moral one. It can never become intellectual. Indeed, when the degree of culture is about the same, the conversation between a man of great intellect and an ordinary man is like the journey together of 2 men, one of whom rides on a spirited horse and the other who goes on foot. It soon becomes very trying to both of them, and for any length of time impossible. For a short way the rider can indeed dismount in order to walk with the other, though even then the impatience of his horse will give him much to do. But the public could be benefited by nothing so much as by the recognition of that intellectual aristocracy of nature. By virtue of such recognition, it would comprehend that when facts are concerned, thus when the matter has to be decided from experiments, travels, codes, histories, and chronicles, the normal mind is certainly sufficient. But, on the other hand, when mere thoughts are in question, especially those thoughts the material or data of which are within the reach of everyone, thus when it is really only a question of thinking before others, decided reflectiveness, native eminence, which only nature bestows, and that very seldom, is inevitably demanded. And no one deserves to be heard who does not at once give proofs of this. And just a quick add-on here by me. This is why democracies and really any other kinds of egalitarian polities, though I understand why people speak of them as being comparatively superior to undemocratic and inegalitarian ones. I understand when they're referred to as being comparatively superior, because that's what kind of the historical record shows. But people speak of those in such glowing terms, democracies and other kinds of, even egalitarian aspirations, but, political egalitarian aspirations. They speak of them as being non-comparatively great. No. To the extent that they are justifiable, it is only in these comparative contexts, because the other stuff we do is tended to be even worse. And no one deserves to be heard who does not at once give proofs of this. If the public could be brought to see this for itself, it would no longer waste the time which is sparingly measured out to it for its culture on the productions of ordinary minds, thus on the innumerable botches of poetry and philosophy which are produced every day. It would no longer seize always what is newest, in the childish delusion that books, like eggs, must be enjoyed while they are fresh, but would confine itself to the works of the few select and chosen minds of all ages and nations, would strive to learn, to know, and understand them, and might thus, by degrees, attain to true culture. And then, also, those thousands of uncalled-for productions which, like tares, hinder the growth of the good wheat, would be discontinued. Finn, shop class dismissed. I don't know about you, but I'm proper spooked. And now, for some other stuff that I recorded while I was out and about, even before I read this stuff, I shall insert. Well, I know where this goes. This is going to be squeezed in between the chapter on the Intellect and the Atlantic article. So the Atlantic article will follow very shortly, but I'm still out and about, and I just got to say a few more things. No better spot to put this in than between, because now you've had your celery, and I'm very proud of you. If you've made it all the way through, you deserve the more risque commentary, which part of me wants to put this at the very beginning of the video, but this is a little too risque, so well into the video now, because I would have read out the Intellect chapter. And as a primer for the Atlantic article, you'll see why it is. But throughout October, the man to watch has been Piers Morgan. I never thought I'd say that. I don't know what his show is called, but he's got this show, Sky News or something like that. And the reason I say he's been the man to watch, it's nothing to do with him, but he's chosen to, because he's been so horrifically affected by this tragedy. I think he means it. He seems to mean it. And so he's chosen to bring on a array of voices who spout different positions. He brought Cenk on. Uyghur just utterly embarrassed himself, pretty much sobbing as he's making his points. But he brought on one guy. I'll link to at least 3 videos of Piers Morgan's show interviewing different people. One of the 3 is the one I'm going to just say a few things about here. He brought on a guy. His first name's Mohammed, but his last name is Hijab. The guy's last name is actually Hijab, and so I'm just going to relay a few things now about my lived experience. So I'm watching this, and I spot Hijab first, and then they announce the first name, and I'm like, God, it can't be. And then I'm spotting myself having the kind of reaction that I know I shouldn't have. And so I'm just saying to myself, I'm kind of doing my self-talk before he's even started to speak. It's just he's been announced. I've never heard of the guy before. But they played a clip before of him just pretty much yelling at the top of his lungs, seeming like he wants to fight because Pierce and Ben Shapiro, they weren't spouting the kind of points that he would have liked them to spout. So he's kind of hollering at the top of his lungs, Mr. Mohammed Hijab. On his YouTube show, they're showing that clip. But I'm here, I just learned of the guy, so I'm going, it's like, you know, I shouldn't have any kind of preconceived notion here just because this man's name happens to be what it is. That shouldn't be a primer. But we are living in a weird space. And so Piers then brings him on. But even before he played the clip, I saw the guy's name. And so I'm like, I stopped myself in my tracks and I'm going, what am I doing here? I shouldn't even have a split-second kind of reaction that, wow, what are the odds? The first and last name combo being that. And I'm just saying, I'm just going to do a clean slate here. I'm not going to make any presumptions. This is just a pure clean slate. This man, I'm going to go ahead and make a prediction here. This man is going to pleasantly surprise me. And shame on me for having even a split-second anticipation to the contrary. But in fact, if you watch the video, if you watch the interview, if we're going to call it, not only was he predictably the worst kind of incarnation of someone whose name is Mohammed Hijab, but he also topped every other condescending Muslim. There's these kind of firebrand Muslims who one thing that's truly outstanding about them is how they nail condescension in ways that I've just never seen any other kind of proponent who is on a program first and foremost to be a spokesperson on behalf of the religion, right? And so Muslims have this uncanny ability to pull off a condescension for which I can't even, it even defies linguistic expression how seamless it is. But he spouts off a few things that aren't pertinent to the debate, and Pierce doesn't know what he's referring to. And so, oh, so you don't know that, Pierce? It's that kind of condescension. He even accused Pierce of stuttering once, like Pierce didn't stutter. But he was just so eager to discredit Pierce as a thinker, as a person who's capable of fair and balanced analysis. And it got more and more clear as the quote-unquote interview progressed. But it's like I had this roller coaster of emotions watching this. First, I had that split second, like I'm noticing what his name is, and that's kind of fucked up. And then I'm like, well, why do that? You're not that, you're an enlightened Westerner. You're not supposed to think that names are cues for anything. And then within minutes, I'm like, oh, no, this is the worst kind of incarnation. And he so profoundly disappointed me. And then I felt like a chump for kind of pep talking myself into wanting to have the opposite reaction, into wanting to be pleasantly surprised and actually thinking that he will pleasantly surprise me. I guilt tripped myself because of my split-second reaction to his name. I then immediately proceeded to guilt trip myself into predicting that, no, this man will pleasantly surprise me, because why would Pierce have him on otherwise? But it's like that clip of him ranting about Shapiro and Pierce, that was actually the highlight, because at least there he was plain angry in the kind of way where there's nothing being held back, fury. But then on the program, it was just that kind of pure, unbridled, masterful condescension. And so I just want to kind of pose this. Do you, dear viewers, do you agree with me that these people who are spokespeople for certain religions, usually these monotheistic religions, they're all condescending in their own ways? They all just kind of pretend that their religions are not mockable. But something that these Muslim ones, and this guy's at the top of the list, Muhammad Hijab, one area where they are head and shoulders above the rest is condescension. And Mr. Hijab is right at the very top of that list. I didn't think it would be possible for a human being to be as condescending and as kind of desperately prying to throw essentially pies in Piers Morgan's face, his interlocutors in this case, face. He's just so eager to throw pies in the face. It's like, it was quite the sight to behold. It was remarkable. I've never seen anything like this level of superhuman. I'm going to call it suprahuman. You know the term supranational? I'm going to call Mr. Muhammad Hijab's condescension as suprahuman levels of condescension, exhibited proudly. But yeah, I do think that the spokesman for the Muslim faith, typically when they bring on some spokesman, like people from this CARE organization, they've just learned the craft, and they think condescension can actually work as a weapon that persuades, as a kind of weaponization of condescension, as something that can persuade the fence sitter. And so I just hope we get to a time where I can be pleasantly surprised. But nowadays, whether it's a Jewish name, a Muslim-seeming name, you go into it and you see the name, and it's just, you can predict what the person will spout just based on their name. It's either there's too much in the way of contrarianism or there's never enough. But one way or another, it's just I can be pleasantly surprised by people. And with that in mind, on to the masterful Atlantic article about decolonization. Enjoy this. I think I've prepped you enough for it. It's specifically the kind of article that Mr. Muhammad Hijab needs to hear, but it would fall on deaf ears. But I have him in mind as I'm reading all these points. This is I kind of have him in mind going la 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 with fingers in his ears and going la 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 as all these points in this article are about to be made and certainly denied by the likes of him. But the article is absolutely bang on. Or no, not deaf ears. Mr. Muhammad Jihad does not have deaf ears. He's got clogged ears. For once, I'm not going to be subtle about what I'm going to title the video with. I'm pretty much just going to blurt it out. No subtlety to this one. Mr. Hijab, Mr. Mohammed Hijab, has got clogged ears. So an article as fantastic as the one I'm about to read will not do any kind of persuasive work for him. But I do sincerely wish we lived in a world where it did. And anyone who can be persuaded by an article like this, I sincerely wish better for them. But as is always the case, my wishes rarely come true. I have no illusions. I'm under no illusions that this article will persuade those it needs to. Nonetheless, it can arm you with a better number of facts than my last video did. Certainly here, the facts are on the side of Mr. Simon. What was his name? Anyway, I just wanted to make the video's title unsubtle. On with the article. And just this, before I get home and actually start reading one little addition here, I'm not going to claim to know what it is specifically, primarily, what specifically it is that Israel needs to do to annihilate Hamas. I'm not going to come here and be one of these pretentious people, intellectually pretentious people. It's like, it's either going to be this or it's not going to be this. And if it's not going to be this, then it's going to have a huge backfire effect. I'm not going to claim to know the future because there have been some patterns in the past. Blah, 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 cycle of violence. I'm not going to pretend to know whether any of these expectations are reasonable, but certain other types of expectations have proven themselves to be unreasonable. And whatever it is that Israel needs to do to annihilate Hamas, whatever happens to be that strategy, if, should chance have it, Israel knows what that thing is, then I hope it pursues it. And I guess I'm not done yet. This is a comically long video at this point, but I can't be done. There's more important things to say. You know, visually in this video thus far, it's a video that needs to be watched to be appreciated properly. Visually, I'm kind of taking shots both ways, but clearly in terms of what I've said so far in my targets, I'm clearly on Team Jew when it comes to this whole thing. But I'm not entirely one-sided. So really, at the close, I should point out a few things that are not so Team Jew, that are kind of more Team Palestine. One of those things is, I'm going to flash this map that shows the vast majority of the world recognizes Palestine as a state, and conspicuous by its absence is the U.S. The stuff about I start talking about how the mainstream press doesn't treat the Ukrainian consensus the way it treats the Israeli consensus. It treats the Ukrainian consensus better. I did mean specifically the press, because the officials in the U.S., well, they're very lenient in terms of what's going on in Gaza. So I did specifically mean the press is not as sympathetic to the Israeli cause, the Israeli concerns. The press isn't, but the officials, the U.S. especially, high-ranking officials, very much are. It's hard to do this kind of analysis, but they do need to blow out these tunnels, the IDF, and that's kind of what they've been doing somewhat successfully. It's the 4th of November right now, and, you know, they're making some progress. But clearly, and this is where I kind of depart from Team Jew, because I think the vast majority of the people who are on Team Jew, they all but say that one Israeli hostage is worth, I don't know how many, but, you know, multiple Gazan civilians dead through these methods. And so it's pretty clear that, that's their calculus. And that's not my calculus. I don't know, I think the most fervent ones would think that something like, you know, even maybe 50 Gazan deaths of civilians, and let's say innocent civilians, kids who can't be blamed for whatever they might believe anyway, like maybe up to 50 if you go to the most fervent ones. You know, the ultra-nationalists. You got to take out 50 Gazan civilians to rescue one Israeli hostage. They'll sign up for that. I wouldn't go for that lopsided a ratio, but what exactly should the ratio be? That's the tough question. But Team Jew doesn't really take this question as seriously as I think they should, because they're still in that either blind rage or fear or both. They're still in that stage, you know, the grieving stage. And I get people who want to grieve what happened on the 7th, but You know, it really should be if you know someone, or even if you know someone who knows someone who knows someone who's been personally affected, then if you want to use words like grieve, okay. But if you're just someone who doesn't know a single soul who's been impacted personally, and you're using words like grieve because you are of Jewish descent, I think that's every bit as silly as if I had been alive in the 40s and I hadn't been anywhere near the worst parts where the kind of Serb butchery took place by the Croats. And so a bunch of my fellow Serbs were butchered, but let's say I was in my own safe haven somewhere in the West in the 40s. And then I use words like grieve. I would just feel so embarrassed for myself if I use this kind of hyper somber terminology for things that don't impact me personally. And we just need to get rid of this type of affectation for public discourse to seem like it's worth a damn. Everyone's just on this autopilot mode, and they don't see how it's just one social signal after another. And it's especially these people who use words like deeply. This is deeply troubling. This is deeply concerning. I don't know why, but I've just been kind of fixated on the word. The people who use a word like deeply and overuse it, they're also the very ones who they fail to see how their expressions of grief are just social signals, because that's kind of the thing to do. And again, I cannot stress enough. If you know someone, and even if you know someone who knows someone who's been affected, then okay, talk about grief. But if you don't, just be a kind of standard rationalist. Don't think you have to depart from rationalism insofar as you're not personally affected. And don't think that anyone should be able to read anti-Semitism into you if you maintain that kind of cold, calculated terminology. But yeah, I don't know. What do you think the ratio should be? To get one Israeli hostage back, how many Gazan civilians, innocent ones, would you be willing to sign off on essentially the murder of through these strikes and especially, these tunnels? I didn't know this was the case prior to the 7th, but a lot of people have been writing about it. Just this intricate tunnel system within Gaza that Hamas, it's kind of ingenious, but it's also really morally corrupt. But at the same time, I got to say that, these guys, it shows the slyness of the half-witted persons who they have just enough intellect to get from point A to point B and to construct things that even some of the wisest minds of all time probably wouldn't have been able to construct. This tunnel stuff, right? There's just so many things that they lack in terms of their intellect, and nonetheless, they pulled off this massive infrastructure underground system. And, you kind of got to give the devil their due, but also you got to stamp them out. But we just got to talk in terms of plain numbers. What is, for the return of one Israeli hostage, what's the death toll that you'd be willing to have that be as the ratio of the, of the out-group that you really hate? Just how much of this is in-group versus out-group before anything else? In-group sympathy versus out-group hostility. In-group sympathy versus out-group antipathy. I think it's a fair amount. And, even then, it's not like it's impermissible for those people to have those views. They can have their views, but they should just come right out and say, that's their views. They believe the life of one Israeli hostage is worth the lives of 50 Gazan kids. Right? And my reservations for that is that we just don't know whether this strategy will be effective in the long term. We just don't know. And it's not like Hamas is the only radical terrorist group in that region. The latest Ezra podcast points out, he brings on another expert in the region. And it's an interesting one because she's done polling on what the people believe on the ground. I can't recite chapter and verse of the stats she comes up with in that polling. I have no idea how reliable this polling is, but she seems to know what she's talking about. But one thing that struck me from that podcast is, Hamas is not even the most radical, bloodthirsty group in this region. It's actually that Palestinian Jihad. I think that's their name. They're actually more radical than Hamas. I didn't know that, so I think that's kind of also worth a mention. So even if you take out Hamas, there's these backup groups that are apparently worse. So what else do I have to say here? Did I cover all my bases? I have some notes that I took, but I'm recording this on the phone, so pardon if I pull up my notes, then the audio is going to be a little disoriented. Yeah, I guess the one thing is that Genk Uyghur, I had to give the devil his due when it comes to, I said some kind of dismissive, callous things about him sobbing. I don't take that back. You should never sob in these public interviews, or even just talk in that, almost sobbing sound. But he's the only person who's made the point that actually I've been kind of low-key thinking about since this whole retribution military IDF mission started, and that is these non-tactical strikes. They might end up taking out the Israeli hostages that you claim to care so much about. So I'll give Mr. Genk Uyghur, Genk as Devin Tracy, the cheap shot artist of all cheap shot artists, Devin Tracy, called him Genk. I'll call him Genk because I'm not a cheap shot artist. But at the same time, I'll point out that, yeah, he brought up a good point, and I haven't heard anyone else bring that up. The IDF, they're risking taking out the hostages because they don't know where the hostages are as well. So to the extent that the targets are within Gaza or somewhere around there, you are also gambling on taking out the hostage. And that's also worth a note. So there. I'm not entirely on Team Jew. But yeah, the fact that the Palestinian side is the side that's got all this baggage in terms of the decolonial narratives, that makes it worse. That makes them wronger. No matter what, that just puts so much wrongness in their camp, and they can't be spoken to. All right, it's freezing out here. I'm stepping back in.
Too male, too pale, and too stale. Too male, too pale, and too stale.
And now, and not a moment too soon, it's time for the Atlantic article. It's called "The Decolonization Narrative is Dangerous and False," and it's by Simon Sebag Montefiore. So I don't know this guy as well, but he's penned a terrific article. We're past Celery at this point, but the furthest thing from Celery is what I'm going to put right after the end of the article, after I finish reading it, because I just recorded it. I kind of had to do something before I started reading. You're going to meet someone. Let's just put it that way. You're going to meet someone, and she's very spooky. But before we get to the spooky lady, let's just read this article, because this is, again, it's past Celery, but it's not as anti-Celery as what I just recorded was. Just a very short clip about a very spooky lady. But with that in mind, article, "The Decolonization Narrative is Dangerous and False." I owe everyone who's made it this far into the video, I owe you all a massive apology. I've been teasing the Atlantic article essentially since the beginning of the video. And now I realize what the video length is without the article. And with the article, it'll definitely be one of these 2+ hour, maybe even 3, borderline 3-hour videos. It's a very long article. It's an important article, a factually important article. But I can't, it's not just that I don't want the video to seem intimidating based on its length for some massive audience, but I don't know. I just don't want this to be a video that's one of these 2+ hour videos. And so what I'm gonna do is, I did read out the article, but what I'm gonna do just for these length concerns, I'm gonna upload it as an unlisted audio, and then I'll throw the link into the low bar of this video. That is, if you don't feel like reading the article yourself, you should read the article, but if you don't feel like reading it, the link will be maybe a few days after I upload the video itself. I'll add the link in because I want to do some graphics with the readout. With these graphics, I'm like a kid in a candy store. That's why I love recording audio so much more than camcorder video stuff. Among the reasons is that I get to be this kid in a candy store. There's just so many options in terms of what to do, and especially this kind of subtle humor through the graphics. And so I'll come up with some graphics for my readout of that article as well, but I can't justify to myself tacking on such a long readout to an already bloated video. So again, massive apologies on my part for teasing the Atlantic article, but now it's it's essentially, I've just realized that now it's going to have to be a separate thing as an unlisted thing. Do return to the low bar of the video if you're too lazy to read out the article itself. Do return to the low bar within a handful of days. I'll have that readout link as a separate upload, as an unlisted upload, and with some nifty graphics. And you know, it's not just that I'm reading it out, I'm also saying things here and there, you know. So when I read things, I also say things here and there. And so, as was the case in the Schop chapter, it's the case in the Atlantic article that I also say things here and there. But the article is primarily important because it's got a lot of seldom remarked on factual things that need to be remarked on more. And so, yes. And yeah, I can't believe that anyone still does YouTube in the standard camcorder recording way. It just shows the lack of the vibrancy of their minds. And I don't know, on second thought, maybe this doesn't even warrant an apology because content will still be available. I've just promised it within a video, but it's going to be within a separate one because I don't know. This video had one too many things in it, and I don't want it to be overwhelming just when people see it in terms of the length in their YouTube box. And you know, I'm so pissed off with YouTube. I've had a number of people tell me that they just discovered the uploads, not by checking their subscriptions, but by just popping over to my channel. You know, I'm already going against the grain in terms of certain things. And I don't need to be going against the grain by having the people who are actually still sub to me, YouTube not putting my videos in their fucking sub box. Why? You know, give me an explanation, YouTube, or at least announce to me that that's what you did, so that, you know, here's a video that's flagged, here's a video that's not showing up in people's subscription box. So, you know, that just made me a little, you know, I'm a little self-conscious about the length now because I know that, you know, views have been in the gutter, in part because of this, in part because of other reasons. But no doubt length is a very intimidating thing, and, you know, people are busy. So yeah, it'll be unlisted, and I'm gonna do some kid in a candy store thing to come up with some nifty graphics for that Atlantic readout. But I encourage you to not wait for me. I encourage you to just read it yourself. Obviously, I'll link the article itself. Appreciate your patience. And you know, even without the Atlantic article, like the fact that I had the late October recordings and then that I just had to do the November 4th stuff, I'm beginning to think that I have an audio recording addiction. And this is going to be one of those things that's going to be really long to diagnose as a serious addiction, right? Because like a century ago, like chemicals would have been fair game for what constitutes an addiction, but the idea like that the hoarders, you know, there's these hoarders, they've even had shows done about them, like the idea that that's a addiction that can be treated or even just diagnosed, like that would have seemed preposterous not just a century ago, but like even just a decade or a couple of decades ago. But now when people say the word hoarder, I think the word addiction makes sense in that context. Like these people are proper addicted to hoarding stuff and not throwing out like useless junk or stuff with sentimental value. Was like, I've never had that kind of a problem, but this audio thing, like I'm just realizing I'm so increasingly leaving my shift and just stepping out to do these. It's a good, because I work overnight, so it's good in terms of the traffic is just, you know, minimal enough. And so it's the perfect time to record. It's just, and it's a good kind of it's a good spot as well, where the lot here is for the most part abandoned. But I am just more and more absent-minded. And then when I come back and I step back in and people want to tell me like what I missed work-wise, I just pivot and I start almost like weaving my audio themes into their conversation. So it's like, it's just bizarre. I may have an addiction here and no one's going to take it seriously because just as they didn't take the hoarding stuff seriously. I've never been this absent-minded and this kind of eager to deflect the conversations that are about work or about something else within work and just go back into my kind of audio mode and try to persuade my colleagues to realize that it's like everything that they're talking about is trivial and increasingly trivial compared to like these audios that for the most part I am recording during my shifts. But yeah, just stepping out increasingly ever more so. You'd have to experience that kind of contrast to see why it's worth remarking on. And I don't know if anyone who does work, who like does a shift style work where you actually have to get out of your place, you don't do remote work, you actually still show up to the building. Like, do you see anything here to be able to identify with? It's like this massive contrast. You step out, you're in a happy zone cognitively, and then you step back in, and it just feels like that sunk zone because you got to deal with the drabby nature of the shift or just whatever they're talking about. Yeah, and I'm just stepping out increasingly. This is the 4th time I've stepped out, not like for a break, but just for like to do the audios. And it's freezing too, so I'm actually gonna step back in. But I just wanted to vent about that. I'm probably addicted to recording audios because the moment I step back in, I'm just thinking about the audios, and I'm thinking about the next thing to say to weave the audios into a single coherent story. But you know, I'm now taking up time for the video, which I shouldn't do. So now to end the video, let's go ahead and meet that spooky lady with her, you know, spooky opinions and ideas and her leaden-like intellect, her leaden-like noggin. Enjoy.
This is Latifa Abush Chakra, and this is what she had to say after the October 7 attack.
Nothing will ever be able to take back this moment of triumph, this moment of resistance, this moment of surprise, this moment of humiliation on behalf of the Zionist entity. Nothing, ever.
She seems nice. Call me presumptuous, call me whatever you want, but just spitballing here, I'm gonna guess that some people just plain don't like some other people. And it doesn't have much to do with beliefs or attitudes of those people who are disliked. Something tells me that there's just certain things that are built in. Spitballing here. Well, it's November 7th. You've just met the spooky lady, but today it's November 7th. I really missed the boat in terms of a speedy upload. Kind of close enough to Halloween season, but it's the 7th. Last few days I just get home and I just pass out for reasons that I'll get into. But passing out when I get home and then waking up when it's time to go to work means I don't get a chance to do this edit stuff. And so I missed the boat, but what I want to point out here that November 7th, 2023 means it's been exactly a decade since the YouTuber Derived Energy died tragically in, I forget the country, but I know he went to teach English overseas and he got caught with possession of, I think it was just marijuana, and then there were these kind of dubious circumstances and he died in the jail. He was in prison. It was just a horrible story. I really liked Derived Energy. He was a great guy, nice guy. Didn't interact with him that much, but I felt bad when that whole thing went down. I wasn't doing these audios anywhere near as frequently. I didn't even think in terms of doing audios. I thought in terms of camcorders, so I just didn't say anything. But now that it's been a decade, and exactly a decade, it's November 7th. He died November 7th, 2013. And so I just want to point out he was a great guy, and it's been a decade, and it really doesn't feel like it's been a decade. The one kind of off-putting thing about him is he was one of these, he had this mindset where when he would glom onto a truth, for example, causal determinism, or moral anti-realism, moral irrealism, meta-ethical irrealism, or I think he was even a non-cognitivist, so he even did that error theory or stuff like that. I forget now whether error theory is within cognitivism or non-cognitivism. That's how distracted I am from philosophical things. But anyway, those kind of endless exchanges were just laborious to watch. So my one thing about how I wish Derived Energy would have done things differently, bless his soul, is he would just glom onto these subjects like the core of morality, whether it's real or unreal, and then causal determinism and stuff like that. And he would just have these endless video exchanges. Those are just so laborious to watch. And it kind of makes me proud of the fact that I'm just not taking the channel that seriously. Like, I don't care if someone dissects the video and I see nothing challenging in what they're doing. Like, for example, someone chooses to like dissect my video, but they just don't know how to make arguments. Like, I'm just so not motivated to like do a response to them, because it would feel like such a waste. Like all the stuff I've got in store, it would feel like such a waste. But you know, he was among those who have that mindset where it doesn't matter how bad the quality and how redundant the quality of someone who's responding to me is, I'm gonna respond to them for the umpteenth time. He was a great guy, nice guy, but he had that kind of bad flaw. That's a flaw that a lot of old school YouTubers had. But to commemorate 10-year anniversary of the death of Derived Energy, I don't know whether his videos are still up. I'm sure someone's mirrored them, because apparently the channel went down, I think. You can still find videos where he was being entertaining. He didn't take himself seriously all the time. So I would recommend typing Derived Energy and sniffing out which are kind of the comedic videos, and just watching those when you have time, and avoiding the kind of endless response cycle videos that are just so, it's just people reiterating the same points to each other over and over and not knowing when to say when. But yeah, it's the 7th and I just missed the boat. I've just been getting home and just passing out for reasons I'll get into in the future. The end. Hey, you listener, you magically patient listener who stuck it out to this point, which can't be more than 100 people. Based on the view retention rate, if you've stuck it out to this point, ooh, those stats are dim. You are, at most, a number of 100 people. Over the course of 2 months, let's say, that's kind of the pattern. Views in the gutter, especially late in the video, but you magically patient listener. Oh, how some schmuck might say, how you are appreciated and loved. But I'm not here to tell you that. My cosmic pessimist ass is not here to tell you anything of the sort. And it makes me convulse, the thought of doing so. But what I will let you know is that you're among the few who get to hear the big outcome. And the big outcome is, no, I wussed out on showing up to work in the Hamas outfit. I 100% wussed out last minute. Aren't you glad you have this knowledge now?